It's a big surprise. Nobody thought the ocean was this deep. So all of a sudden we've got scientists saying, why is that?
The ocean has a place where the familiar map of life and light ends, and the planet feels less like a habitat and more like a pressure-welded secret. At roughly 11,034 meters, the sea is no longer just deep. It is hadal, the trench realm where water becomes a crushing medium, sound becomes a primary sense, and the landscape is shaped by the slow violence of subduction. This is the depth where older bathymetric estimates sometimes land near that number, where the seafloor is not a broad plain but a narrow scar in Earth's skin, and where the idea of an ocean zone stops being a tidy textbook gradient and turns into a harsh, vertical frontier. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. Down there, pressure is the dominant law. Every component of a body, a machine, a sensor housing, a cable sheath, is asked the same question by the water column above it. What are you made of, really? The answer has to be more than strength. It has to be resilience to long-duration compression, tiny imperfections, fatigue from descent and ascent, and the cold that slows chemistry into a near-frozen patience. The temperature is typically close to the edge of freezing, oxygen is present but scarce, and food is an unreliable rain of particles that may have begun as a plankton bloom months earlier. Animals that live in this zone are not just adapted, they are built around the assumption of scarcity and force. The ecological boundaries that matter at this depth are subtle. The hadal zone is often described as an extension of the abyssal, but in practice it behaves like an island chain stretched downward. Each trench can support distinct communities shaped by local chemistry, by the topography of the trench walls, and by the way currents and landslides concentrate organic debris into the deepest basins. Where the abyssal floor is a vast desert, hadal troughs can be oddly lush with specialized amphipods, snailfish relatives, and microorganisms that metabolize with a discipline that seems almost unreal by surface standards. Life here is not romantic, it is meticulous. That is why the recent recordings from a lander that reached around 11,034 meters have unsettled the people who work closest to the boundary between biology and geology. The device was built for routine hadal measurements, long-term acoustic monitoring, chemical sampling, low-light imaging, vibration detection, and microcurrent mapping. The mission profile was ordinary by trench standards: slow descent, careful touchdown, minimal disturbance, then hours of passive listening and brief spurts of observation, designed to avoid attracting scavengers in a way that could skew results. The expectation was a quiet dataset with a few surprises in chemistry and a modest catalog of animals. The first deviation was not dramatic, just wrong in a way that reads like a typo but is not. A sequence of pressure micro-oscillations appeared after the lander settled. Not the gentle settling of sediment, not the faint tremor of distant tectonic movement. These were patterned pulses spaced with a regularity that ran for several minutes, ceased, then returned in shorter bursts. The frequency distribution did not match known equipment resonance. The instrument self-checks showed clean baselines. The pulses seemed to originate outside the frame, traveling through water and seabed both, as if the local environment was briefly acting like a drumhead under an unseen hand. The second deviation felt almost too cinematic for serious logs. The water temperature in the immediate boundary layer above the sea floor spiked in a narrow band, then fell, then spiked again. At that depth, quick thermal events are unusual. The trench floor is stable, insulated from the surface by kilometers of heavy, cold water. Thermal anomalies can occur near hydrothermal features, but the signature here was not a steady plume rising with mineral-rich warmth. It was abrupt and localized, like a heartbeat of heat passing sideways through the sediment. The chemical sensors registered transient changes that suggested disturbed pore fluids, a cocktail of reduced compounds being released and then diluted in minutes. Then came the acoustic data. The deep ocean is never silent. It is busy with distant earthquakes, the groan of shifting plates, the faint, high-speed language of small animals, and the strange, long-range hum of storms far above. But this recording contained a layered sequence of sounds that did not fit the known catalog. Low-frequency moans rising into a mid-band chatter, followed by a high, brittle clicking that repeated in bursts with a geometry that suggested movement around the lander rather than a single source. The pattern was not clean enough to be confidently labeled as biological signaling, yet too structured to be dismissed as random sediment noise. The video system, which relies on sparse frames to conserve power and avoid flooding the scene with light, captured something that left every interpretation feeling inadequate. A slow, expanding field of bioluminescence appeared in the mid-water just above the bottom, not as discrete points of animals, but as a diffuse sheet. It looked like a veil unfolding. The brightness was faint but coherent, as if multiple organisms were responding to the same stimulus, or as if a single large disturbance was pushing luminous life into a coordinated defensive display. The sheet passed over the lander and thinned into darkness. Minutes later, a second wave came from a different direction. No single piece of this is impossible. Trench landslides can generate pressure pulses and chemical releases. A cluster of scavengers could produce complex acoustic signatures. Bioluminescent responses can propagate through a dense patch of organisms. The horror, if that is the right word, lies in the way these signals stacked into a sequence that suggested escalation. The sensors, designed to read a quiet world, seemed to be documenting a localized event with multiple phases, each one affecting a different dimension of the environment. It read like a storm without wind, like a confrontation in a realm where confrontation rarely looks like anything we recognize. A more disquieting inference emerges when you consider the hadal zone as a place where geology and biology are braided tightly. Trenches are disposal sites for surface carbon, but they are also active fault systems. A sudden release of fluids can alter microbial blooms. A microbial bloom can attract larger scavengers. Large scavengers thrashing in soft sediment can trigger small collapses that release more trapped chemistry. At 1134 meters, even a modest disturbance can cascade through the system because everything is compressed into a narrow basin. The trench is a funnel for energy of all kinds, from falling detritus to tectonic stress. The recorded vibrations, if they reflect a small local seismic adjustment, carry implications well beyond a single lander dataset. They hint at micro-events that might be undercounted in global models of subduction behavior. Hadal floors may be more active in short, quiet bursts than we can detect from surface networks. If true, this would matter for understanding how stress is redistributed along plate boundaries, and how small adjustments accumulate toward larger ruptures. It suggests a blind spot in our planetary sensing, a region where the Earth may be whispering frequently, but our ears are mostly directed elsewhere. The chemical anomalies are equally provocative. A sudden pulse of reduced compounds at that depth could feed a bloom of specialized microbes in minutes or hours, creating a micro-ecosystem tethered to a geological exhale. This tight coupling would be a reminder that the hadal zone is not solely a food desert reliant on surface rain. It may also be a patchwork of chemically driven oases, transient and unpredictable. That possibility would complicate how we estimate carbon sequestration in trenches. Carbon might not just settle and wait, it might be recycled in bursts, altering the deep ocean's role in long-term climate buffering in ways we do not yet model well. The bioluminescent sheet hints at behavior we have barely conceptualized. We tend to imagine deep-sea light as a private language of individuals, a flashlight flicker in a cold void. A coordinated field suggests density, connectivity, and shared triggers. If the trigger was a shockwave through water or sediment, then the organisms here might be tuned to detect and respond to tectonic or mechanical disturbance with a communal display. That would be a remarkable case of ecological adaptation to living on a fault line, where survival might depend on the ability to react instantly to the first sign of a sudden slide or pressure surge. The acoustic sequence may never settle into a single explanation, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the event feel so grim to the people reading the logs. Sound at that depth travels through a layered medium of water, mud, and rock. It can be refracted, echoed, and warped into patterns that mimic intention. But if even part of the mid-band chatter was biological, it suggests a behavioral complexity among hadal scavengers and predators that we have not mapped. We know far less about hadal food webs than we admit. The deepest zones are still a theater of unseen interactions, and every new recording may reveal that our assumptions about who eats whom and how violently are still surface biased. The reason some scientists might appear to stay silent after a dataset like this is not necessarily secrecy in the conspiratorial sense. It can be the weight of interpretive responsibility. In a field where sample sizes are tiny and each expedition is expensive and rare, extraordinary signals can overwhelm cautious method. A single anomalous sequence can ignite headlines that flatten nuance into spectacle. Researchers who have spent careers trying to protect deep-sea science from sensational distortion may hesitate to publish preliminary interpretations of an event that reads like a composite of multiple rare phenomena. That caution, however, exists alongside a real concern about how human activity is creeping toward the hadal realm. Deep-sea mining proposals, trench-adjacent cable routes, and increasing ocean noise all raise the stakes for understanding these ecosystems. If the event was triggered by a natural microslide, it still demonstrates how sensitive the hadal environment can be to disturbance. If it was triggered by something mechanical, such as an unrecognized interaction with drifting debris or a remote anthropogenic impulse transmitted through the water column, then the implication is sharper. Our footprint could already be reaching the deepest places in subtle, measurable shocks. There is also a technological lesson embedded in the recording. Landers are designed as passive observers, but in the hadal zone, the line between observation and participation may be thinner than we think. A structure placed on soft trench sediment can change local currents, create microturbulence that stirs fine particles, or offer a hard surface that attracts organisms not otherwise concentrated in that patch of seafloor. If the recorded sequence involved animals investigating the lander in large numbers, the event may be a reminder that our instruments are never neutral. The hadal zone might require new observational strategies that reduce habitat interference even further. Philosophically, the event underscores how little of Earth's biosphere is truly inside our story of nature. The hadal zone is not only hard to reach, it is hard to imagine correctly. We are tempted to interpret patterns as messages, to see menace in unfamiliar rhythms, to project surface metaphors onto deep phenomena. Yet the deep ocean is full of order that does not care if we recognize it. The horror some researchers feel when confronted with a dataset like this may not be about monsters or mysteries. It may be about confronting the limits of our interpretive frameworks, the awareness that reality can be structured but still unreadable to us. The recorded sequence also challenges the neat educational boundary of ocean zones, as if the planet were a layered cake of stable habitats. At 11,034 meters, the hadal zone is less a layer and more a dynamic pocket where influx and compression create episodic drama. The environment is defined by steep walls that can shed sediment, by basins that can trap organic material, and by a constant tension between scarcity and sudden abundance. This event, whatever its root cause, illustrates that hadal life may be adapted not just to poverty, but to irregular shocks that punctuate long stretches of quiet. In terms of evolution, a world where pressure pulses, chemical exhalations, and mass scavenger convergences occasionally surge through a trench floor would favor organisms that are both patient and opportunistic. It would favor sensory systems tuned to vibration and chemistry, bodies resilient to brief spikes of turbulence, and behaviors that can switch rapidly between cautious stillness and intense feeding or avoidance. The hadal zone might be a cradle for a style of life that is less about constant equilibrium and more about surviving unpredictable episodes of change. The implications for future exploration are clear, even if the interpretation remains unsettled. We need more persistent sensing at depth, not only short visits. A single descent is a snapshot. If this event is part of a broader pattern of episodic trench activity, then long-term observatories could reveal cycles linked to tides, distant seismicity, or seasonal pulses of surface productivity. The next generation of hadal instruments may need to combine robust mechanical isolation, higher resolution chemical monitoring, and adaptive acoustic filters that can differentiate between biological swarms and geophysical noise with greater confidence. The most unsettling aspect of the recordings is how they force a rethink of what counts as a meaningful signal when you are working at the extreme limit of observation. At that depth, the smallest anomaly can be either the key to a hidden process or a mirage created by the strange physics of compressed water and fine sediment. The event was terrifying partly because it looked multi-causal. It didn't feel like a single explanation waiting to be named. It felt like a knot of processes tightening in real time, the kind of knot you only notice once it is already pulling on every instrument you have. One implication is methodological humility at a scale the hadal community already lives with but rarely has to explain to outsiders. When scientists work in these conditions, they cannot simply rerun the experiment next week. The rarity of missions means that interpretation must be both bold enough to be useful and cautious enough to survive. Scrutiny years later, a dataset that presents cross-domain spikes in mechanical, chemical, optical, and acoustic channels simultaneously is a gift and a trap. As a gift, it suggests a real environmental episode. As a trap, it tempts a single dramatic story that might not be earned yet. The challenge of classification becomes central. The deep sea is an arena where our interpretive categories are shaped by what we have previously encountered, mostly above hadal depths. When a pattern does not match existing libraries, the risk is to label it as unprecedented without checking whether the library itself is simply too small. This event implies a need for a global, shared repository of hadal signals, not just species lists but physical and behavioral signatures. A standardized way to tag microvibrations, sudden boundary layer chemistry shifts, and mass luminous responses could allow researchers to compare episodes across trenches and years, turning isolated astonishment into a coherent archive. It also raises the possibility that hadal basins are sites of episodic ecological synchronization. Even if the triggers are non-biological, the biological responses may be rapid, collective, and layered. This idea changes how you might design future sensors. Instead of focusing on single target detection of an organism or a single chemical pathway, the optimal approach might be designed around event recognition. The goal becomes identifying the onset of a cascade, tracking its phases, and distinguishing whether the driver is mechanical disturbance, fluid release, or a sudden biological congregation triggered by some unseen cue. That shift would open the door for more dynamic instrumentation. Imagine landers that can alter sampling frequency when the first sign of an episode appears, switching from slow baseline logging to high-resolution bursts. The implication is not just better data, but the potential to catch the internal logic of these events before it dissipates. If the recorded episode was brief and layered, an adaptive system might reveal the sequence in finer detail, providing the difference between vague dread and a grounded mechanism. There is a parallel implication for materials, science, and engineering. Instruments at such depths are already pushing the edge of what is feasible. But a multi-phase event suggests that the environmental stresses landers face may be more variable than design assumptions currently emphasize. It is one thing to build for static pressure and slow sediment settling. It is another to anticipate sudden localized surges in currents, sediment clouds, or microshocks transmitted through the seabed. The event hints that robustness might need to be defined in terms of dynamic resilience, not just a single safety margin against compression. The same logic applies to deep-sea acoustics. The ocean's deepest soundscape is undercharacterized. We treat it as a faint extension of the more familiar abyssal background, but the recordings imply that trenches might have their own acoustic personalities. The geometry of steep walls and narrow basins can shape how sounds are trapped, amplified, or refracted. This has implications for how we interpret any unusual sonic pattern. The sound may be telling us as much about the trench as it is about the source. That pushes acoustic science toward more modeling of hadal basin acoustics, treating the landscape itself as an active filter. Biologically, the event suggests we may be underestimating the behavioral intensity possible in the deepest ecosystems. We tend to imagine hadal life as slow because energy is scarce. Yet scarcity does not preclude short windows of extreme activity. A sudden availability of resources, even if only indirectly linked to the event, could drive rapid congregation and competition. If the episode involved a brief concentration of food or a chemical cue that suggested opportunity, the visible and acoustic patterns might reflect a short-lived but highly consequential pivot in the local food web. This matters for how we think about population dynamics. If hadal communities feed in pulses rather than steady trickles, then models of energy flow based on average rates could miss the real story. The event hints at a punctuated rhythm, long quiet baselines interrupted by bursts that may account for a disproportionate share of feeding, growth, and reproduction. That would redefine how we estimate the resilience of these communities to disturbance. Systems that rely on rare pulses may be more fragile than they appear if those pulses are disrupted or mistimed. The microbial angle becomes even more crucial under this view. Microorganisms at these depths are sometimes treated as background recyclers. But a rapid chemical episode implies that microbes might be the first responders, expanding quickly, shifting metabolism, and altering local chemistry in ways that ripple upward through the food web. If a transient release of reduced compounds occurred, even for minutes, it could have sparked a bloom whose impact on oxygen microgradients and nutrient availability might shape the behavior of larger organisms. This suggests that hadal ecology may need tighter integration between microbiology and animal behavior studies, rather than treating them as separate layers of inquiry. The event also carries implications for contamination science and the uncomfortable reality of human reach. Even without assigning blame to any specific human action, the deep trenches are known to accumulate sinking debris and micropollutants from the surface. An episode of sudden sediment disturbance could resuspend contaminants that have been buried, briefly increasing exposure for scavengers and filter-feeding organisms. This is not an aftermath story. It is a structural implication of how trenches operate as sinks and how episodic disturbance might turn a sink into a short-lived source. The event makes a subtle point. The deepest places might not just store the surface's legacy, but occasionally remobilize it locally. A broader environmental implication is how this challenges the romantic framing of the deep ocean as a stable, final refuge. Conservation strategies that treat the hadal realm as inherently protected by distance may be under-planning for the unique vulnerabilities of trench ecosystems. The recordings imply that internal dynamism is part of their nature, and that external pressures might intersect with that dynamism in unpredictable ways. Management that assumes slow change could be surprised by systems that change in short, intense episodes. This naturally intersects with policy discussions about deep-sea industrial expansion. A scientific community confronted by an event that looks like a sensitive, cascading episode may become more cautious about endorsing activities that could introduce mechanical or acoustic disturbances in or near trench environments. The implication is not that all human use is automatically catastrophic, but that the baseline understanding required to responsibly evaluate risk may not yet be adequate. The event argues, indirectly but strongly, for a higher standard of evidence before new disturbances are added to a system that already experiences natural pulses of stress and response. There is also an implication for data ethics and communication. When a dataset carries an emotional charge, researchers face a dilemma. The public deserves engagement with discovery, but sensationalization can warp research priorities and funding pressures. A disciplined silence, or a temporizing one, can be a way to protect the integrity of interpretation. The event demonstrates how easily a complex episode can be pulled into narratives about the unknown that overshadow the actual science. For hadal researchers, controlling the story might be less about secrecy and more about preventing the distortion that could follow if preliminary patterns are framed as definitive mysteries. In that context, the event invites a deeper look at how we design public-facing language for extreme environment science. The goal would be a vocabulary that can convey genuine strangeness without drifting into myth-making. Because this zone is already distant in the public imagination, it becomes especially vulnerable to being turned into a stage for fear. Yet fear is not the only appropriate response. Respect, curiosity, and careful awe may be better cultural frames for a realm that is alien, mostly because our access is limited. One of the most intriguing implications extends beyond oceanography into planetary science. The hadal realm is one of the best analog environments on Earth for thinking about life in other high-pressure, low-light worlds. An event showing rapid cross-domain responses suggests that even in extreme conditions, dynamic episodes can create windows of opportunity for life to behave collectively and adaptively. This has relevance to how we imagine subsurface ocean. Environments on icy moons, where localized chemical or mechanical pulses may drive biological activity in bursts. The lesson is that life might not need constant abundance to express complexity. It may need occasional triggers that reorganize behavior and metabolism. The same analogy pushes us to reconsider what we define as a biosignature. If a future mission elsewhere detects episodic chemistry shifts paired with energy signatures that suggest coordinated response, we might be tempted to dismiss them as noise. The hadal event shows that episodic, layered patterns might be exactly where life and environment intersect most visibly. On Earth, our challenge is to avoid misreading the event as something beyond nature while still acknowledging that nature in extreme settings can look dramatic. Another implication lies in statistical practice for rare event science. When you have one prominent episode in a limited dataset, the temptation is to treat it as either a wild outlier or a profound new category. The more responsible path may be to treat it as a hypothesis generator. That approach invites a structured plan for how future missions could test for recurrence without framing the event as a singular mystery. The event implies the value of designing studies that are explicitly built around capturing rare episodes, possibly through multiple low-cost landers deployed simultaneously across depth gradients within the same trench. That multi-lander approach could allow researchers to resolve whether such episodes are spatially localized or propagate along trench axes. If an event is detectable at several stations with time-lag patterns, it would strongly support a geophysical driver with broad influence. If it is confined to one sensor cluster, it may imply a more local biological or micro-geochemical trigger. The implication here is that the next leap in hadal understanding may come not from a single flagship descent, but from networked observation, turning the trench into a monitored system rather than a visited place. The event also nudges us to rethink the boundary between hazard science and ecology. At shallow depths, these disciplines often interact through coastal risk and reef disturbance studies. In the hadal realm, they may be inseparable. The recording suggests that an ecological event may be initiated or shaped by hazard-like microdisturbances in the seafloor. That blurring implies new interdisciplinary collaborations, where geophysicists, microbiologists, and animal behavior specialists build shared models of episodic dynamics rather than handing interpretations across silo boundaries. On the cognitive side, the event is a reminder that humans are pattern-seeking creatures, especially when confronted with incomplete data. At extreme depths, the visual record is sparse, scale is hard to judge, and sound can be misleading. The implication is that analytical frameworks must intentionally guard against overinterpretation. This is not a call to dull curiosity. It is a call to build interpretation pipelines that can handle ambiguity while still extracting usable signals. Machine learning may play a constructive role here, not as a magical classifier, but as a way to detect subtle correlations across sensor types that human intuition might miss. Yet automation introduces its own risks. Training models on limited deep-sea data can amplify biases, leading to false confidence. The event implies that any AI-assisted interpretation will need careful calibration and transparency about uncertainty. A system that says this pattern looks like a landslide, or this acoustic cluster resembles scavenger swarms, must also display confidence bounds and alternative matches. The deepest ocean is not an environment where black box certainty is acceptable. There is, finally, an implication for how we conceptualize the hadal zone in the broader narrative of Earth systems. The deepest trenches are sometimes treated as endpoints, where material sinks and the story concludes. The event suggests a different metaphor. These basins may be active processors, occasionally jolted into states that reorganize sediment chemistry, microbial activity, and animal behavior. Instead of seeing them as passive graves of carbon and debris, we might need to see them as intermittently active engines with their own timing and internal thresholds. If that is true, then the hadal realm becomes more central to global science than its physical size might suggest. not because it dominates total ocean area, but because it may operate as a sensitive indicator of how geology, chemistry, and life co-evolve under extreme constraints. A single recorded episode at approximately 11,034 meters becomes less a standalone shock and more a signpost pointing to a class of processes we have not yet learned to parameterize. The fear in the scientific reaction, then, is understandable without needing to be melodramatic. It is the fear of realizing that the bottom of the world is not fully knowable through our current lenses, and that the complexity we are discovering may require a new architecture of observation, collaboration, and humility. The deep does not have to be supernatural to be unsettling. It only has to be real in a way that exceeds the stories we are used to telling. What this event ultimately implies is a future where hadal research becomes more event-centric, more networked, and more attuned to the possibility that the most revealing moments in the deepest ocean are not the quiet baselines, but the brief, layered eruptions of activity that stitch the living and non-living Earth together. The trench at that depth is not merely a coordinate on a chart, it is an active boundary zone where the planet occasionally reveals its most compressed conversations, and where our instruments, when they are lucky and strong enough, catch a fragment of that dialogue before the darkness closes again. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on terrifying deep ocean events scientists refuse to explain? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.